Ferdinand, quote, had a real reputation, but being a disciplinarian, but still a strong family person. He died from the injuries that he got with encounter with a bull that had been in the family for some times, and the story was the kids were riding the bull the evening before, but the next day it turned on would have been my grandpa, and then he died from the injury sometime later.
Then she met Ferd Krueger, who was a neighbor. And I don't know how old she was, but she was past 18, I think, when they were married. But they couldn't get married right away because he had to earn money in order to build a barn and a house. It's sort of a tradition in this Krueger family that you always build the barn or the shed before the house. Even the grandkids do it, as you know.
My understanding, they built the barn first and built the house in 98. That had been 1898.
Anyway, he went to work in Spokane and earned enough money so that he could come back, and he and a neighbor man built a house after they did the barn. And Grandma told me one time, Carolyn that is, said that, oh, it was a nice wedding, but you know, we had to walk 3 miles to get to our new house. And they did. Ferd and Carolyn ended up having 11 children. All of them grew to adulthood. And she welcomed each one of them as if it were her first child, I think, because she took it so for granted that being a mother was her duty, her place in this world. She did have a funny story. I can't remember which girl was about to make her appearance on this earth, but they were visiting someone, and they had the horse and cart. Well, Ferd and Carolyn were visiting this particular night and having a good visit when Carolyn said to Ferd, "We'd better go home, I think the baby's coming." And in his usual way, he just kept on talking. She said, "We had better go home now, Ferd. The baby is coming." Well, the first time this had happened, you know what happened with Ferd. They got halfway home and he passed out. He got so excited he passed out. She grabbed the reins. She drove them home in the cart. And when she told me that story, I said, "My goodness, you grabbed the reins and drove that horse home, and you were about to have a baby?" She didn't mention the baby. She said, "Well, you know, I always was good with horses." Another time, let me see. Oh, 2 times. Yeah, 2 times I've heard. She had the baby there all by herself because Ferd was in Portland on shopping day. He had a town day about once a week, I think. Sometimes he'd stay overnight with Carolyn's mother in Portland if the day had been too long. Other times he'd come home the same day. But he came home, and as my mother, Emma, said, they came home from school and they heard crying in the bedroom, another baby. And that happened twice, that she took care of the baby all by herself, delivered it. Otherwise, I understand that she had neighbor ladies who would come in. And again, Ferd really proved his bravery when one of the older boys had come. He just exited the house and left. He found he didn't want to be there when the baby was born. It was more than he could handle, so he took off and left her there alone with the neighbor lady.
My father told quite a few stories about the family and growing up, and no doubt there were lots of stories with 11 kids, but one he always told about his father, Ferdinand, was every afternoon there was a couch out under the trees outside the farmhouse on the homestead, and that was his nap time. After they had done everything, he would go take a nap at about 1 o'clock, and that's when he took his rest. And if he wasn't in Portland selling things off the back of wagons or farm crops or something like that. But Dad said, you know, he always felt he deserved a little rest because that was his thinking time when he was doing business in his mind. So,
well, Grandma was pretty lenient when it come to Grandpa making his wine. The only time that she got excited was in probation. He wanted to put a still up there by the spring. Now the spring, they had gravity feed all the way down to the buildings in those days, and it was an ideal place to put a still. And Grandpa said, come to Grandma, and he says, you know, he said we could make a lot of cash. He called it cash money. And Grandma put her foot down, and she said, "Ugh, you will never have a still on this place."
My mother, Emma, had a lot of fond memories of growing up in the Krueger family. She had many fond memories of her mother, her dad, her brothers and sisters. She especially never forgot what her dad did. She had been told to never ever play with scissors, but like the kid that she was, she used the scissors to try to rip a string off of beads off her doll, and the scissors went into her eye. It was near evening, and of course she hit the pupil, and the pupil broke, and it was bad, and it hurt her a lot. So it was too late to go to a doctor. The very next morning, bright and early, they headed out to Hillsborough, and when they got there, the doctor said, "I can't do a thing for her, but I'll call ahead to Good Samaritan. You get in the cart with the horse and go as fast as you can." And of course, in those days, there was just one road. I think it was Canyon Road. It was like a plank road. At any rate, her father took her with a horse into Portland, and all the way he sang to her, he told her stories, he tried to tell jokes to try to get her mind off of what had happened to her eye. He never once scolded her for it. And she said, "I sure deserved to be scolded, but I guess it was bad enough. I knew that I had really done something wrong." And afterwards, after she had been taken care of at the hospital, apparently they did a good job, because 40 years later, 50 years later, whenever she went to an eye doctor, they'd always say, "What happened to your eye?" And she'd tell them the story. They'd say, "Well, you know, if it had happened yesterday, we couldn't have done a better job on it than the doctors did when they took care of you." Ferd and Carolyn had a very good relationship. We keep in mind they were both German, and the German attitude was that the man is the boss. Well, that could have been true, but she worked. We got to remember, she worked in the fields as well as in the house and with the children. And she handled the horses, as she said, in regard to having to drive that cart home. She would go out in the field and help him with, especially during haying time. She would help him with the horses and the wagons and all. She'd leave a little before noon to run in and fix a meal for everybody. And then they'd go back out in the field again. Everybody had a job. You were not to be lazy. You had to work. But when it came time to dinner time, she would probably have gone in a long time before he did. But when she saw him coming in with the team, she said she always liked to go out to the barn, and that was their together time. The kids didn't bother them. They'd go out there, she'd help unharness the horses, put the harness up, and that was the time they could visit and have a little time with just the two of them. And that was important. They did that almost every time that he had outside work to do. Ferd passed away in 1929. after being gored by a bull. And it seems that they had this bull that had been in a pen, and the children were all told to stay away from the pen, don't go near it, and the bull was mean, which proved that it ended up that the bull truly was mean, because Ferd had always trusted the animal and thought that he was the one who could get in and feed it and all. One day it turned on him and it gored him. It hurt his spleen. And in those days, they didn't realize you could live without a spleen. So the doctor didn't do anything about it. And little by little, infection, I suppose, I don't know. The death certificate mentions leukemia as a contributing factor. So I really don't know exactly what it was, but it had to do with being gored by the bull. And he passed away, leaving her the head of the home, head of the house. And I think she just kicked into gear. That old German attitude of being in charge and always being able to handle things. She was the same person she'd been before, but it seemed easy for her to just take over. She did, however, move to Linton at the time, into a house that Ferd had received from a banker who, instead of going bankrupt, had divested himself of everything that he owned. And to Ferd, he had given some property, including a Linton house. And because one of the younger boys, Ray, was ready for high school, and Mabel wanted to go to beauty school, and Myrtle was already in Linton, living with her older sister, going to, I think, Banky Walker, which was a business school. Anyhow, because of all this, Carolyn decided to move into Linton. She didn't stay there more than, seems to me, maybe 6 or 7 years. And during the time she was gone, 2 of the boys took care of the farm, lived in the house, and ran everything out in the country.
But after he passed away, the role did really fall to Grandma, and she certainly, I think, filled the role as being the linchpin of the whole family. And I think people would come and visit with Grandma for advice or comfort or encouragement. But Grandma certainly stepped in, and it was always Grandma. I remember when Uncle Ed passed away, he was in Alaska with a family, my aunts and uncles. Uncle Ed's brothers and sisters all gathered at Grandma's house to discuss the problems of Uncle Ed being up there and how to get his body down here and all. And it was always at Grandma's house, and it was always with her input as to any family activities or decisions that were being made. It was always Grandma always had a hand, either directly or indirectly, and I don't remember it ever being anything else.